hear me?
Dr. Meghla, I'm here.
Yeah. Yeah, so she's here to talk about the immunological tests and their interpretation, which we always find it extremely challenging, which is the blood levels, which is the uterine levels. It's also confusing. So it's rather better to have the pathologist to interpret it and tell us where we stand and what it is. And as you all can see on the screen, she has a lot of goodies in her kitty with so many awards for so many things and having achieved so much. Must be feeling great though. Please do enlighten us about what is the laboratory aspect and how should we do and what are the tests we should do, when we should do, and how exactly should we interpret it.
Yes, Dr. Meghla, thank you so much for your
We welcome you to this panel and please do give your input on this.
Thank you so much. I hope I should be able to help you in understanding this.
Yes,
and whatever queries are there, I will definitely go ahead with it. And can I share the screen?
Yes, ma'am. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Is it visible?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. As I said, Dr. Sundari has given a very beautiful introduction, very crisp and nice, and made my things much more easier. Similarly, Dr. Chaitra has also covered up quite a few things, so I don't think it should be, this is interrupting for me. These pictures, can I, okay.
No, it's
Dr. Chaitra has also made it very easy for me because she has already given an introduction of the various causes which are there, and I just need to go about what are the investigations which need to be done. To begin with, actually, as Dr. Sundari has very clearly said that what do you mean by recurrent pregnancy loss is basically traditionally we used to consider it as 3 pregnancy consecutive miscarriages, and now it is about 2 or more consecutive miscarriages as per the American Society of Reproductive Medicine and the European Society of Human Reproduction and Embryology. When it comes to implantation failure, it is generally defined because what happens in a natural pregnancy, you would not even realize sometimes that there has been a loss at times, that there has been a failure in the implantation. So at that time, basically, here what it is now defined as failure to achieve clinical pregnancy after transfer of at least 6 good quality embryos in fresh or frozen IVF cycles, or of at least 4 embryos in 2 egg donations. I think this is something which you will know better as obstetricians. And immunological factors do play a very big role in recurrent pregnancy loss, most of which are autoimmune, and there are a few other alloimmune factors which are there. The most common of the autoimmune disorders which cause recurrent pregnancy loss or implantation failure are antiphospholipid antibodies. Then I'll talk a little bit on thrombophilia, because they are much related to the antiphospholipid antibodies. Thyroid antibodies, we would just touch on that, and ANA. And when it comes to the HLA and the HY antigens and endotoxic antibodies, there have not been much studies about them. There has been no standardization of the protocols, and therapy has also not been useful, so we will not really go into that. Finally, I'll just briefly talk about the NK cells. Coming to antiphospholipid antibody syndrome, it is a syndrome which is defined as a co-occurrence of antiphospholipid antibodies with the characteristic clinical symptoms, that is either a thrombotic event or an fetal loss and pregnancy complications. We all know that it's one of the commonest causes of recurrent pregnancy loss immunologically, and it is a treatable cause of recurrent pregnancy loss, well accepted and evidence based. So that is the reason where it needs to be worked up properly for so that we can treat the patients at the earliest before they have much more losses. And it is associated because it is associated with recurrent miscarriage, intrauterine growth reduction, preeclampsia, placenta abruptio, as well as premature delivery and fetal death. Just let us look at this. when it comes to antiphospholipid antibodies, the pathogenesis, the antiphospholipids act directly on the blood vessels. These are usually produced by the B cells, of which the commonest is the beta-2 glycoprotein, which attack directly the endothelial cells and they promote coagulation. So they can actually act directly on the blood vessels of the maternal circulation, as well as they act on the trophoblast as well as on the implant. So it has a multi-factorial thing. How does it work actually is, so it causes coagulation, clotting, and pregnancy wastages. When it comes to the trophoblastic cells, it acts on the annexin A5, which is present on the maternal surface, as well as it acts on the trophoblast cells, which leads in turn to increased complement activity, decrease in the proliferation of syncytia, decrease in human chorionic gonadal troughings, apoptosis, and finally it also causes an inflammatory milieu, which is leading to an increased complement activity, as well as netosis, increase in the vascular endothelial activity, leading to inflammation, finally leading to pregnancy complications and clotting because of decrease in the protein C levels as such. So when we look at the antiphospholipid, when do we do this testing? So there has been an earlier Sydney classification, which was then replaced with the Sapporo's classification, which underwent a change in the 2006, if I'm not 2012, wherein they added one more antibody. Basically, it is here you have to meet at least one clinical criteria and one laboratory criteria before we call it as a antiphospholipid antibody. The clinical criteria is, of course, one of them is vascular thrombosis, one or more clinical episode of arterial or venous small vessel thrombosis in any tissue, and the pregnancy morbidity when it comes one or more unexplained death of a morphologically normal fetus beyond 10th week of gestation, one or more premature deaths of a morphologically normal neonate before 35th week of gestation, which could be either because of eclampsia, preeclampsia, or recognized features of placental insufficiency, or 3 or more unexplained consecutive spontaneous abortions before the 10th weeks of gestation. So here it was earlier, it is only the second trimester, but we are seeing now, even if it is in the first trimester, we have to think of antiphospholipid if there have been 3 or more, but provided you rule out the other factors first, like anatomic, hormonal, paternal and maternal chromosomal anomalies are excluded. The lab criteria, it is lupus anticoagulant, the anticardiolipin antibody, and the beta-2 glycoprotein antigen and antibody are the ones which have to be present on 2 or more. A lupus anticoagulant should be present at least on 2 or more occasions 12 weeks apart before you, as per that, it should be done as per the ISTH guidelines. I'll come to that in detail. And anticardiolipin antibodies should be present again at least 12 weeks apart in serum or plasma. And with a high titer of about 40, then you can be very sure on that. Beta-2 glycoprotein is one of the commonest. Lupus anticoagulant, I'll keep this, yeah. The lupus anticoagulant was the first antiphospholipid antibody which was discovered. And it is basically a misnomer. It is not an anticoagulant, though it is called as anticoagulant. It has more of a procoagulant activity. That is why it's a misnomer. I'm sorry. 2 tests have been recommended for lupus anticoagulant. One is the APTT, which is called as the high sensitive or the LA sensitive APTT, but it is not adequate. Rather, it is better to do a dilute Russell Viper venom test in addition to an APTT. One thing we have to bear in mind is that if the patient is on oral anticoagulants, if the patient is on heparin, sometimes you might get a lupus anticoagulant which is prolonged and it might alter the results. So we have to keep that in mind, though usually we are able to rule out by doing the mixing studies. Not just that, there have been studies which have said that if there has been a patient who has had an LA, there is a 50% chance of a thrombotic event over 20 years. So they could possibly be predictor, but it is not very clear. Let us not go by that as far as diagnosis for recurrent pregnancy loss is concerned. Lupus anticoagulant is a clot-based assay. Here we use a snake venom, which is called as the dilute Russell Viper venom, which activates the factor 10 in the presence of factor 5, PT, calcium, phospholipids to form a clot. If there is a presence of a lupus anticoagulant in a patient, then it will bind to the phospholipids and will inhibit the clot formation, leading to the prolongation of the clot, which has to be confirmed with excess phospholipids, which neutralizes. So we have 2-3 steps which have to be followed for as per the ISTH guidelines. The other antibodies which have to be done are the anticardiolipin and the beta-2 glycoproteins, which are the ones which are usually used for diagnosing an APLA syndrome. Lupus anticoagulant is a clot-based assay, so it requires a citrate plasma, whereas anticardiolipin antibodies and beta-2 glycoproteins are ELISA-based assays. Anticardiolipin antibodies are the most sensitive of the antiphospholipid test. It does not actually, the ELISA plates are coated with the cardiolipin, and to which these anticardiolipins go and bind, which include the beta-2 glycoprotein, prothrombin, and anionic phospholipids. So they are more sensitive but less specific than beta-2. So when it was found that beta-2 glycoprotein is also one of the major, in spite of having a beta-2 glycoprotein available onto the coated surface, when you independently did a test for beta-2 glycoprotein, we could detect them earlier. That is why now it has been added into the new criteria. So low positive results are less important, naturally so, and about more than 40 units you could be sure. The most significant of them are the IgG class, which correlate better with the history of thrombosis than IgM. And IgA is still uncertain, though we do include it in our testing because we do not know what is going to, what are the studies which are going to indicate over a period. Beta-2 glycoprotein is discovered in 1990, and this is one of the strongly associated with clinical complications of antiphospholipid, more specific though less sensitive than the anticardiolipin antibody. So let us, when I said lupus anticoagulant antibody clot-based assay, we have to do 3 steps. Let me just tell that here it is in this particular slide. I would like to just say how do we interpret this. If an APTT is done and if your APTT is prolonged, it could mean anything. It could be because of a factor deficiency, or it could be an inhibitor like a lupus anticoagulant. So that being the thing, it just indicates that there has been a prolonged APTT or prolonged clotting which is there. Any one of these factors could be there. Lupus anticoagulant, for lupus anticoagulant, you would use a specific test like a dilute Russell Viper venom test, which is also called as the LA screen. And here if you see, the value is around 63.4, which means it is the reference range we have given is up to 46, which has to be established with each lot. Okay. So if it is high, then it indicates that it is positive. Now, I need to be sure that it is basically lupus anticoagulant only and not anything else. So what I do is, we know that lupus anticoagulant will go and bind to the phospholipids and cause inhibition of the clot formation, and that is how the clot has got prolonged. I give excess of phospholipids so that it will, now this clotting is possible. So here what has happened is, after addition of the DRVVT confirm, where we add excess of phospholipids, you will see that the correction has happened. So this ensures for me that the neutralization of that lupus anticoagulant has happened by adding the excess of phospholipids, and that is the reason I'm very sure that this particular assay is a lupus anticoagulant test. And of course, we do a ratio, and based on the, which is done by the KC on the test, by the control ratio is calculated. And based on the ratio, we say it is as weakly positive, moderately, or strongly. So here I would like to say that it is not enough to say that if an APTT is prolonged and had the LA been normal, then we will not think of it as a lupus anticoagulant. It could be because of another factor deficiency, which is there, which is causing a prolonged APTT and may not have been because of lupus anticoagulant. This is just a simple test. Here it is very simple to interpret. It is done by ELISA, that is the cardiolipin antibodies, as well as the beta-2 glycoprotein. You have the reference intervals which are given here. Here the patient's value is 38.6. We say that if it is beyond 40, we can be very sure. But I think it also goes by the other clinical picture, which is to be taken into consideration, as ma'am had already said initially, that you can't always go by the criteria that we will have to see. Many a times, both lupus anticoagulant, this is a patient particularly where both LA was positive as well as beta-2 glycoprotein. Both are taken from the same patient. And if you see that both of them are positive, indicating that definitely it is a case of antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. Now, antiphospholipid antibody we have said, and because it is a thrombotic kind of a tendency which causes placental infarct, which leads to the decreased in the circulation to the placental tissue and causes fetal mortality. But other than that, there are other conditions which cause clotting problems where there is a propensity to develop thrombosis due to the abnormality in a hemostatic, which can be either genetic or acquired or both. Pregnancy is, of course, a hypercoagulable state. So that is the reason why we need to work it up. Could be because of acquired factors or because of inherited factors. Your basic pathology is there is a thrombosis on the maternal side of the placenta, which leads to impaired placental perfusion and causing a fetal loss. This is usually seen in the later losses, and very early loss, it is not very clear. As far as this acquired thrombophilia workup is concerned, the most common of them is antiphospholipid antibody, which we have already covered. The other things could be fibrinolytic system defects, malignancies, hematologic disorders, nephrotic syndromes, obesity, more than 50 years of age, pregnancy, oral contraception. All these are actually reasons of acquired thrombophilia. These need to be worked up, but basically the most common of them would be the antiphospholipid antibody. If they have, you do not need to work up every patient of recurrent pregnancy loss for a thrombophilia, complete thrombophilia, I would say. Whether the acquired is enough, if you do an initial antiphospholipid is enough. If suppose antiphospholipid antibody is negative and still you need to further work up and you feel that there is an additional factor which the patient has which could be causing thrombosis, or if there has been a strong family history of thrombosis, or patient has had an episode of thrombosis, then we need to work up for the thrombophilia. So the inherited thrombophilia causes are antithrombin deficiency, abnormalities in protein C and S, resistance to activated protein C, which is the factor V laden defects, hyperprothrombemia, homocystinemia, dysfibrinogenemia, elevated factor 8, factor deficiency 7, and abnormalities of the fibrinolytic system and heparin cofactor. Of this, the most common are the antithrombin 3, protein CS deficiency, factor V laden, and homocysteine are the ones which are there. Let us remember one thing: whenever there is a circulation in the blood vessels, the blood keeps flowing constantly, and only when there is an endothelial injury or if there is been a stasis, like how we remember in the Virchow-Stroud, which we have read it time and again through our medicine, that then only that there will be a clotting. And when that clotting happens, the coagulation proteins are the ones which will cause the clotting, as well as with the help of platelets. But the clotting is kept in check in circulation by regulatory proteins like protein C, protein S, antithrombin 3, factor V laden, and prostacyclin. I'll just go over this small simple flow chart so that we can understand how do these actually work. Both the intrinsic pathway as well as the extrinsic pathway lead to the activation of the factor 10, and factor 10 plays a role in converting the prothrombin to thrombin, and finally which works along forms the fibrinogen to fibrin and forms a clot. So these have been inhibited. There are many inhibitory mechanisms which control coagulation in the vascular system. Factor V is, of course, a procoagulant that helps promote the conversion of prothrombin to thrombin. The activated factor V is typically inhibited by the complex of protein C and protein S, which keeps the formation of the clot in check. If there has been a deficiency of the protein C and protein S, then there would be a hypercoagulable state. Prothrombin is converted to thrombin if there has been a mutation in the prothrombin, like a G20210 mutation polymorphism, results in increased production of prothrombin and leads to a hypercoagulable state. Antithrombin typically inactivates, I cannot use a pointer here, so typically inactivates the thrombin, leading to less conversion of fibrinogen to fibrin, and antithrombin deficiency automatically is a hypercoagulable state. So this is how it works, and APC resistance so leads to a hypercoagulable since factor 5, which is not inactivated as quickly. If there has been a defect in the factor 5 because of, say, a factor 5 laden defect, then we might see that there could be a hypercoagulable state. The other causes could be a homocystinemia, which is the most common cause is dietary restriction of folate and vitamin B12. So it's a very commonly treatable cause. Here, if there has been hyperhomocystinemia, if there has been a gene mutation which has occurred, like cytosine 677 has been replaced by the thymine, it is responsible for reduced MTHFR activity, which results in decreased synthesis of the 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate and formation of homocysteine to methionine, and results in increased plasma homocysteine concentrations. This definitely has a threefold increase in deep vein thrombosis as well as preeclampsia and placental occlusion, probably because of interference in the embryonic development through defective chorionic villus vascularization. Very easily treatable cause. Coming to the lab testing, which I have already mentioned, antiphospholipids, lupus anticoagulant, and cardiolipin and beta-2 glycoproteins are the ones which are the tests which are done. LA is a functional assay, a clot-based assay, and cardiolipins and beta-2 protein glycoproteins are ELISA-based, and it requires a serum sample which is used for rest. The protein S is again a turbidometric clot-based assay. Protein C and antithrombin 3 are chromogenic assays, which again require a serum sample in which the normal ability to cleave the substrate molecules causes a color change, which is then visualized. And APCR is a APTT-based, clot-based assay again. It is usually we use a surrogate for the APCR mutation which is there. We do here what we do is we add the give the activated protein C is inhibited, and that is how we see the clot being prolonged. And if the ratio is decreased, if there is a deficiency, the ratio is decreased less than 2, then only if required we can go for a mutation confirmation of the test for factor 5 latent defect. Homocysteine is most commonly done by the chemiluminescence assay, and we do not really require to do an MTHFR on a regular basis. Fibrinogen is a clot-based assay, basically to understand whenever we do any clotting process, we look for the PT, APTT initially to begin with, and then we go for fibrinogen assays to decide whether and if it is because of to understand which pathway it is involved. Factor 8 and CRP. CRP is basically used for any of these immunological workups just to understand it is an acute phase reactant. And finally, as I said, that we do for genetic and molecular testing for both prothrombin as well as a factor 5 laden. Factor 5 laden we usually do only if there is a decreased APCR result, otherwise it is not really required. So now we have a full battery of cardiolipins, protein C, protein S, factor 5 laden defect, as well as antithrombin 3 along with the lupus anticoagulant. Here again, this is a case, one of the cases where both protein C was showing a deficiency. In addition to that, LA was also positive, along with probably the patient was already on anticoagulants as this patient was there. So, and finally, when it comes to ANA, Dr. Chaitra has covered that ANA is a test, has been known to be associated with recurrent pregnancy loss because it's supposed to have a direct toxic effect on pre-implantation. And what is ANA is basically a very preliminary test as far as autoimmune disorders are concerned. So it is a heterogeneous group of antibodies. It's not a single antibody which is directed against the different nuclear antigens. It is frequently associated with elevated as antiphospholipid antibodies. What I would like to say is when you do an ANA test, one thing is that it could be related to recurrent pregnancy loss, but it also helps you to understand probably the patient has any other autoimmune or connective tissue disorder like SLE, which could be contributing to the patient having a stillbirth or a recurrent pregnancy loss. Because we know very well that SLE, patients with Sjogren's syndrome, La antibodies, Rho antibodies, these could all be associated with recurrent pregnancy loss. The ANA can be done by multiple methods like ELISA and immunofluorescence, but it is best to do it with an immunofluorescence microscope, using an immunofluorescence by indirect immunofluorescence method, because here we are able to see the cells directly, and there has been an international consensus on this, which was started as an initiative in 2014, where even the various patterns have been described and the reporting format has been described, wherein we have to say if we do it by immunofluorescence is considered as the gold standard, because if you do the immunofluorescence pattern, we are able to say whether it is a nuclear stain, or cytoplasmic stain, or a mitotic stain. And they have now been, they have given a competence level at which we can do the reporting also, so that everybody is able to follow a protocol, and there is a harmonization in the way the tests are reported. Otherwise, we used to have a lot of problem where some people would report it in 1 in 100, some in 1 in 40. Best ideal is to do a titration. If not possible, then even if you do a titration, at least one dilution, then we usually give an intensity score of a 1+ to 4+ to say how much of the fluorescence is, how strongly it is present. So if not, and if required, you might have to do a titration over there. So when we do an ANA by an immunofluorescence pattern, we are able to see different patterns, and that in turn helps us to understand which are the antibodies which are associated with it. This is a very, very concise and a very small and a old slide actually. Now there are much more antibodies which are present. So, but I would just like to say that based on the pattern, like if it is involving the nucleus, whether it is a homogeneous pattern, a speckled, a centromere pattern, or a peripheral or a rim pattern, and if it is a cytoplasmic, whether it is a ribosomal or a mitochondrial, that helps us to understand which is the antibody which is actually present, and which needs to be further worked up by either doing a profiling, either using an ELISA or a blot assay, which is much more cost effective, where we do an immunoblot assay and we assay for the various antibodies which are there. And on the right hand side, you can see these are different types of patient samples, different samples, and it's just a representation to say that the patient may have an SSA or SSB positivity, or it could be an SCL70. This will help us in further workup in the connective tissue disorders, as well as in sometimes, because once an ANA is positive, it has to be further worked up for what is the ANA positivity which is there, and which is the antibody which is present, whether the patient is a plain antiphospholipid antibody, or the patient has any other autoimmune condition like SLE which is there that could have contributed to the patient's recurrent pregnancy loss. And this is another instrument which we have, wherein we do a dot blot assay, where we do 24 antigens for separation of the antibodies. So here we have so many tests which we have covered, and initially only someone told me that it becomes confusing, it becomes complicated, which is the test that we need to choose. So there, it's a jungle out there, and we sometimes feel a little lost of how do we go about the testing. So the easiest thing would be initially do a workup, which is very simple, is only the antiphospholipid antibody workup, which would be the lupus anticoagulant. I'm re-emphasizing it again and again. Lupus anticoagulant, anticardiolipin antibodies, and beta-2 IgG antibodies, along with probably an ANA, just to one is because it could be, because now there are studies which say that it could be contributing to recurrent pregnancy loss, and also to understand if there is any other autoimmune factor which is there, because it's basic test for any kind of an autoimmune condition. And then if it is negative and the patient has a strong family history of thrombosis, has a recurrent loss, or a patient has had an earlier episode of thrombosis, then we can work up for hereditary workup could be done, like homocysteine levels, protein S, protein C, factor V Leiden, APCR, and thrombin 3 assays. First we do the functional and the chromogenic assays. In case something is positive in that, and then you can go for the genetic workup. Otherwise, it is not really required. If it is positive for confirmation, if required, you could go for a genetic workup for factor V Leiden or prothrombin. So you just do a basic APLA workup, And if required, do a hereditary workup. If you get a etiology in that, well and good. If there is confirmation, you can do the genetic workup. Antithyroid antibodies. This is a test which is very commonly done. Every pregnancy, most of you all do a thyroid levels, and hypothyroidism has been identified in 7.6% of patients with recurrent pregnancy loss. I won't get into much of the details of this, just that whenever there is patient has hypothyroidism, it is advisable that it is even antithyroid antibodies should be done for both thyroglobulin as TPO and TPO antibodies to work up the patient in a better way to understand probably it is because of autoimmune thyroiditis, which is the etiology, because it may represent a marker of an underlying T cell defect that directly affects the implantation. So that could be responsible for either a maternal hormonal imbalance, it can cause trophoblastic invasion abnormalities or placental thrombosis. So that will make us understand that it will help, and these are the very commonly done tests like antithyroid antibodies and thyroid, so which are usually done by a chemiluminescence method, and routinely done test. I won't go much into that. Another thing which has become a lot of discussion, a debatable test which is being done is the natural killer cell and T cell function, which is the alloimmune function that what you're looking at, and in recurrent pregnancy loss and implantation failure. One thing we have to remember is that there is a difference in the NK cells which are present in the peripheral blood and the uterine cells. The peripheral NK cells increase was associated to be increased with increased risk of recurrent pregnancy loss, though, and in implantation failure, though their role is not very clear. Various studies have been done on that, and they represent basically a surrogate marker of an underlying pro-inflammatory status in a case of a recurrent pregnancy loss. Usually these cells are cytotoxic cells, and they release interferon gamma and secondary IL-10, which cause cytotoxic activity. The peripheral NK cells are defined by expression mainly of the CD16 and CD56. Most of the cells which we see in the peripheral blood are the CD56 dim when we do a flow cytometric analysis. So usually these are CD56 dim cells, and these usually cause cytotoxic activity, and they are most abundant, about 60 to 95% cells. Whereas the cells which we usually see in the uterine are usually the CD56 bright NK cells. This is a flow cytometry image just to show that how we do the flow cytometric analysis on the peripheral blood for NK cell analysis. We usually do a complete panel of a T, B, and NK cell. We do CD3 cells, CD19, and a CD56. Of course, CD45 is always taken up as a stain initially because that is for the common leukocyte antigen. And the CD56 cells, the lower as I said, the lower plot which you are seeing, they are the ones which are positive. And these are expressed usually when we do a flow cytometric analysis. The advantage is that we are able to give a percentage or an absolute count. But as far as recurrent pregnancy loss is concerned, currently there is no consensus on what should be the cutoff. There are various studies. Some of them have shown 12%. If you take usual count, which you take is around 5 to 15% is what we give the reference interval in our lab. But when it comes to RPL, I think Dr. Chaitra and the team, Dr. Chanshik, all of us are working now where we are doing the TB NK cells. Probably we can work on how much would be the percentage which will be helpful for us to take as a cutoff in our population to see whether recurrent pregnancy loss can be evaluated. One thing also we need to realize is that the menstrual cycles and the OCP will cause variation. So it is better that it should be taken, the sample should be taken at a defined patient from the patient, and only from those patients who are not already on steroids and oral contraceptive, because all these will cause a variation in the NK cells. So this counts. So you might find a patient who has got the test done just in the 6th or 7th day of a cycle, and if she comes back again to get the test done around the 21st day or 22nd day, then definitely there would be a variation. So we should be bearing in mind that there could be a variation in the peripheral blood NK cell activity. The other thing of interest is, of course, the uterine natural killer cells. Dr. Chaitra has described in detail that innate immunity plays an important role, and of which the uterine NK cells, which are present on the maternal-fetal interface. So there is a nice talk, which is a crosstalk, which happens between the maternal as well as the barrier of the fetal surface, and in between over there, the trophoblastics, at least implantation, which retention of the implant is what it happens, and they are kind of protective over there. And during implantation, NK cells form a major lymphocyte population in the endometrium, then followed by about 15% of 20% of monocytes and 15% of the T regulatory cells. The uterine NK cells are usually CD56 bright, as I've already said, and they have low cytotoxic capacity. So if you see that there we were saying that they have a cytotoxic activity, whereas those which are in the uterine have a low cytotoxic activity. Rather, they have high producers of cytokines such as the transforming growth factor beta and IL-10, chemokines, growth factors including IL-8, vascular endothelial growth factors, SDF1, IP10, involved in tissue modeling, trophoblast migration, neogenesis, and implantation. So they help in formation of the vascularity as well as in the trophoblast implantation, which happens over there, formation of the syncytial trophoblast. All that activity is helpful for the NK cells will help them. Hence, if there is an alteration in the uterine NK cell profile, then it leads to a cytolytic activity, inhibition of the placenta of the HCG secretions, complement activation, cytokine imbalance, and failure of the Th2 response, leading to and favorism of Th1 response and pregnancy loss. One thing I would like to tell here is, when we tried, there have been studies which were been published about the uterine NK cells being done by flow cytometry. Yeah, as far as peripheral blood, we definitely go only for the flow cytometry. But when it comes to the uterine or the endometrial tissue, the lymphocytes which we are seeing, if we do by flow cytometry, the problem over there is, for flow cytometric, it has to be in a flow. I mean, it has to be in a single cell line, and you have to pass to the flow cytometer. So we have to mince and digest the tissue with the help of enzymes. And this becomes a problem. So it becomes sometimes very difficult to obtain sufficient endometrial tissue for doing the flow cytometric analysis. The samples may be contaminated by the procedure when you're collecting by the peripheral blood, which will cause an interference. And expression of the cell surface markers may also be changed by the enzymatic digestion which happens for the tissues. The only advantage there is you can rework on the subsets of the NK cells, whether they are CD56 dim or CD56 bright, but otherwise that could be okay. But for analyzing, when you're doing it for a recurrent pregnancy loss, it would not be helpful, because there again, as I said, there are problems that we will not get the right kind of a sample for an assay, as well as because of the loss of the cell surface markers. So ideally, what would be better, and what recently we have adopted in our lab, is that we are doing immunohistochemistry, which is done on a biopsy sample. So basically, when it comes to immunohistochemistry, it is done on a regular block of the tissue, which you have analyzed already for endometrial biopsy procedure has been done. So it allows measurement of the cells in situ. You can go back to the block and do the analysis over a period also, and it confirms that the cells are within the tissue. It provides an indication of the histology of the endometrium. We are able to also see the rest of the histology. Sometimes there could be an endometritis, there could be any other problems which are there, which we also are able to examine, and then these cells are then expressed as cells per hyperfield or per total stromal cells. But currently there is no proper cutoff. We usually report it as 10 per hyperfield. Variable studies are there which say that right from 5% to 15% variation per 10 hyperfield could be there. The one thing which has to be remembered is the biopsy has to be timed precisely according to the LH surge, and preferably taken 7 days post surge, because during the LH surge, the variability in the NK cell is very high. So even if there has been a 1 day delay, that can cause a variation in the results. Ideally, it is taken 7 days post the LH surge. This is a slide which shows that we have done few cases recently. So we have done the CD3 cells, CD20, CD4 and CD56. CD20 is of course negative. CD3, we can see so many cells over there. This is a cluster where it was present focally. CD4, CD8 is usually negative, and CD56 also. So there are about 3 or 4 in the CD56. The lower right hand corner is the CD56. Right above is CD20, CD3 and CD4 are on the left hand side. So CD3, and then we report them as so many cells present per 10 hyperfield or per, along with it, and we are also able to see the other stromal cells which are present. So these CD56 are present both on the lymphocytes as well as on the stromal cells. So we comment on the presence of this CD56 based on the stromal cells. I'm going into this, that uterine NK cells are different from peripheral blood NK cells. This has to be emphasized. Both have an independent role, and measurement of the peripheral blood NK cells when you are doing any studies are of limited value in understanding the role of the uterine NK cells in reproductive failure. There is no indication as of now for patients presenting with infertility or IVF treatment. It is only for patients with recurrent pregnancy loss, when you will have ruled out all the other causes and you would rather like to look at it, or probably for studies, it is a matter of debate whether to do it. And since there is no proper treatment also as of now, it is not really recommended by any of the guidelines as of now. The measurement of must be standardized, and the definition of normal high levels for this standardization is still in the process. So keeping the limitations of the NK cells, we have to work on the decision making when it comes to the recurrent pregnancy loss. Thank you so much for very patient hearing. If any queries are there, I'm there to ask.
Thank you, Dr. Renuka and Dr. Sundari and Dr. Chaitra for a quick overall view on the reproductive immunology. I mean, basically, as an immunologist, we know that it's a little complicated perception with reference to how the pregnancy and the immune system behaves at with reference to pregnancy, how things goes, how things changes to accommodate the growth of the baby in a mother is something which is it's really something which is very interesting, very keen, and which it really is something which has given a lot of insight into the reproductive processes that goes on. I mean, it's been in the earlier days, it was thought it's a simple the process that it's the nature's endeavor to keep the reproduction as an ongoing process. So that being the case, we thought it could be a very simple process the nature would have accommodated to have the pregnancy process going on. But in a true sense, as we start understanding about it, it makes a huge, what we can say, the processes into place to achieve the basic goal or basic, what I can say, the concept in which the living organism continues. Because one of the major objective of a living organism is to reproduce. So that being one of the objective, it is expected the process to be more simpler, more easier, more convenient for the process to happen. But that's not how it is. I think I can say that we have only understood 20% of what's really happening from the immune system perspective currently. And we are trying to work and manipulate within whatever the informations we have to get the best goal out of it. I think you could see there are a lot of question marks left in every speakers, because starting from Professor Sundari's presentation, so there are a lot of issues which are there, recommended, not recommended, strongly not recommended to use. And again, the role of ANA, whether it works, whether it helps, whether it doesn't make a important inference when you are trying to manage. I mean, there are a few questions to the speakers, which has come out from a few of the attending delegates. I think Dr. Ashia Sultana has asked that can we take ANA as a cause for infertility? I think the question is open to all the three speakers. They can. Yeah.
It's not taken as a cause for infertility. It is only for, as we know, this just says that she has got antibodies and she can develop any type of antibodies. Probably it is not a direct cause for infertility. And we never have, I think, infertility specialists, usually they don't ask for ANA. They mostly ask for APLA. Definitely it causes implantation failure, because as Renuka was explaining how it happens at the implantation site, what exactly happens because of this antiphospholipid antibodies. It acts on the cytotrophoblast, it acts on the syncytioblast, it causes apoptosis of the syncytial. She's beautifully brought it out. That's the reason why we give heparin not after the confirmation of the pregnancy, but after the, not seeing the fetus or the gestational sac in the scan, but only soon after the pregnancy test is positive, we do at least that time when the implantation is occurring, these antibodies are there. That's the reason heparin exactly nullifies all these actions of the antibodies. Complement activation 3 and 5 activation, all these thrombosis, all these things are nullified under inflammatory reaction. All these have been activated, nullified by the heparin, so it has to be given as soon as the pregnancy test is positive. Having said that, this ANA doesn't have such effect. Only effect what we have ANA is, I think Chandrasekhar would tell us nicely. If there, as Renuka again said, whenever there is an ANA is positive, we need to ask for the profile. In the profile, low and low antibodies are positive, then the cause or the concern is that the fetus may get a congenital heart block. We had 1 or 2 cases where Dr. Chandrasekhar beautifully helped me to get the patient to be put on steroids so that we screen the patient. Right now also we have a patient who is going on, in fact she is my own student. She is a positive. She again has Chandrasekhar's patient only, and she is going through periodically echo of the fetus to know whether there is any heart block. That is a concern for us when the ANA is positive. Rather than ANA causing infertility, we don't come across, or there are no papers saying that ANA causes infertility.
It does not cause infertility. Yeah, correct.
Yeah.
It does not cause infertility, but it will also give us an understanding that there is some autoimmune process which is going on when an ANA is positive.
Yeah. Indirectly, so, probably that autoimmunity can affect the pregnancy if it is of the antibodies which are concerned for the pregnancy survival.
I think just to put the immunological perspective, I think the panelists have already explained most of it. See, the ANA can be interpreted in multiple ways. So one of the major challenge when we speak of ANA is not a single entity. ANA, as you know, represents more than hundreds of the different autoantibodies. We thought it is 12 initially, now we have stretched to 28. Now we know it is more than 40 to 50 are described. I think in all probability it should be more than 100, because we have, and nucleus is nothing but a bag of antigens. So now the concern that comes is the ANA can be either a cause or a bystander. So what I mean is, say for example, whenever there is a persisting chronic inflammation, say for tuberculosis, say for a viral infection, I think you might have with the current COVID thing, you might have seen with COVID infection, you get quite a good number of autoantibodies. Why that it happens is there is a polyclonal activation, which is a part and parcel of any autoimmune process. So that being the thing, ANA in that kind of situations may be representing a polyclonal autoimmune activation, may not be the cause of the concern. Or if there are autoantibodies like Rho, La, or some of those antigens which are very unique to placenta, if it is present, it itself can produce an immune complex and trigger an inflammation at the site of placenta. So it is always very difficult for us to use that ANA, which is a bag of antibodies, to be very specific and precisely answer these questions. Why the recommendations are in confusion is basically, this is something which we all have to understand, because recommendations are put based on what I have to do for 100 patients. And it is not for 1:1 patients. What I meant here is, I think Ashia has pushed that question again. she said very clearly that if I have a rheumatoid factor, ANA also positive, and she is infertile for quite some time. So treating the rheumatoid or ANA, will she become fertile? I mean, the question is in her scenario. We really don't know about that case. Suppose if in her scenario, if the autoantibodies are interfering in implantation, then that is the cause. So and because of the hundreds of, I mean, we can say that % of the normal reproductive age group of women are positive for ANA. That being the case, it is very difficult for us to go for a proportion or a percentage. And to prove that ANA does make a problem, you need to work on more than 50,000 of patients to work on to figure out, yes, ANA makes a problem. So that's how the meta-analysis could show it, but the individual studies may fail to demonstrate that ANA could be the definite cause for the recurrent pregnancy loss. So best is to work on 1:1 basis to see whether how much you can interpret that autoantibody to be responsible for recurrent pregnancy loss, or is it a non-specific autoimmune response that is there. I think to answer this, actually Praveen Kumar also has posted one comment. He has written clearly that especially if there is antibodies of two types, anti-TPO plus ANA, there is a possibility of increased risk of recurrent pregnancy loss rather than one of them being present alone. So what it means is, it suggests that there is an extensive autoimmune process which is going on. And I think there is one more question from Dr. Murli Krishna. What is the percentage of NK cells we can take it as contributable to recurrent pregnancy?
There are variable studies. Some studies have mentioned it as 12% and some as 18%. So there is no fixed criteria as of now. So that is the thing that we are facing the challenge over there when it comes to the peripheral blood NK cells. Routinely, normally what we report is 5 to 15% in a normal population, biological reference interval, I would say.
So I think there is one more question. I mean, I couldn't make the name because it's written as Vivo 1951. I mean, I don't know the name of the delegate who has posted. What is the role of steroid and IV immunoglobulin in a woman with 4 first trimester losses, but ANA status and APLA is negative? Sundari, yeah, please.
Immunoglobulins, there is no role absolutely in any of these cases. It is given up saying that immunoglobulins have no role. Now coming to the steroid, as we know, we have a specific indications for steroid, especially if it is a first trimester losses. Probably it could be unexplained APLA syndrome. It could have been so that extensive antibody titers they would have they should do, I think. First trimester losses after excluding the chromosomal abnormalities, the next common thing would be APLA. So APLA, unless there is a SLE associated APLA, we don't have a role for steroid. Steroid as such has a role only in one thing, SLE associated with APLA syndrome, or sometimes we are using it in a ANA positive in a high titers and patient has a recurrent pregnancy loss, as just now beautifully Dr. Chandrasekhar has explained to us of the inflammatory process, how it triggers off. To bring down that inflammatory process, probably we put them on steroids. Apart from these two conditions, there is no role for steroids in a case of RPL. And the IV immunoglobulins have been given up in all cases. Though we used to say leukocyte toxicity, there were paternal leukocytes and IV immunoglobulins, there was a time when it was used. But only place where there is a small role for immunoglobulin is resistant APLA syndrome. In spite of giving a heparin, and the patient still goes for a pregnancy losses, that's a place where they are using IV immunoglobulins. But there are few centers where they claim a very good results using these IV immunoglobulins, but in the literature, immunoglobulins are not used in RPL except for this rare cases.
Yeah, even in our setup, routinely in IVF practice, we we don't generally use immunoglobulins routinely ad hoc. In fact, I don't remember using it for anyone.
There's no role.
Yeah, no, I actually see currently as we look at an IV immunoglobulin role in recurrent pregnancy loss is still a questionable. We don't have enough proof to say that it is really useful. The only scenario where it is used as a necessity is in the ITP, not for the recurrent pregnancy loss, but to get the platelets up when the woman goes for a delivery, because there is a possibility of a torrential hemorrhage if platelets are low. That's a place where you have a definite role for IVIG, but otherwise there is no specific role. But I think if you wait for some more time post inauguration, you have a case where resistant refractory things are managed by us. We can discuss about that at length after the presentation of that. I mean, there is one more question from, I think, Dr. Asya. A case with consecutive 3 pregnancy had congenital heart disease and parents' karyotyping was normal. Again, she is pregnant and has a congenital heart disease. How to work out of these patients?
Here, I think ANA will help possibly. Yes. Because it's better she does an ANA over here and for anti-Ro, anti-La antibodies also and check it out. I don't know. I think you should be able to tell better.
And in them, genetic counseling is very,
genetic counseling, yeah.
And what type of heart disease we have to know? Okay, the recurrence, whether these heart diseases, what type of heart disease the fetuses have got, we have to know. And then a genetic counseling is mandated in them. Along with that, as Renuka said, first thing we could do is ANE and see if it is normal, low and Ro is normal, probably we have to send them for the genetic counseling.
Yes, ma'am, like Ro, SSA1 and SSA and SSB, when it's positive, what happens, these are the antibodies which can actually cross the placenta and affect the fetal cardia. So it is suggested from 18 to 28 weeks, we follow up with the fetal echo also being done consecutively. And in case we do have changes, then definitely introduce Mineralo and glucocorticoids, which we usually be using only glucocorticoids. We shift on to a combination of Mineralo and glucocorticoids. If I'm correct, sir.
So I think we don't have much more questions. Any questions from panelists or anything else to be delivered as a final message from all the panelists to anything, Professor Sundari, specifically?
Yeah, torch infection should not be done. And unnecessary heparin should not be given. The moment RPL, especially IVF centers, due respect to all of you, and they start off a heparin for the patient. Unless there is a specific indication, heparin should not be used, because I had a patient who had it with the heparin, and osteoporosis can occur. She has a vertebral collapse and she has gone in for paresis. But she was APLA and this was the 4th pregnancy. I had to give her heparin, and of course she came out of it, but it can cause. The cost is one, and it can cause osteoporosis. Though low molecular weight heparin cannot cause thrombocytopenia, but it can very well cause the 9 months of duration. If we give, it can cause osteoporosis. So definitely, unless there is an indication, we are not supposed to use heparin. Again, heparin indication is only APLA. Nothing else. So we should not use empirically heparin. Aspirin, of course, it can be used because it is safe that now people are using it. It can be used, but heparin and same thing, torch infections should not be done in a recurrent pregnancy loss at all. That's my message to the viewers as far as RPL is concerned.
I think
there is one more question also.
Last question. Probably I will just take it. Is SSA is positive and fetal echo was normal? Is there any chance for neonatal to develop congenital heart block after delivery? Answer to that question is no.
No.
The neonate, whatever the congenital heart block or myocarditis due to SSA, SSB Rho 52 happens most often between 22 weeks to 31 weeks. So usually if it crosses 31 weeks, chances of getting CHB is also very less. So if after 31 weeks, if it doesn't happen, definitely it will not happen after the fetus is out of the mother. So, I mean, there are few concepts, probably one we need to understand when we are working with reproductive immunology. I always keep telling this for everyone to understand is, see, we have a sort of a compartmentalization we have to work when we are working with these recurrent pregnancy loss secondary to immunological disturbance. it is expected by nature rule or law that the maternal uterus is the best place for the embryo to grow till the age of 37 to 38 weeks and then to come out. Sometimes for varieties of reasons, including an abnormal or a disturbed immunological functions, the system may become hostile. So that's the point where the recurrent pregnancy loss or the late pregnancy loss occurs. And after 28 weeks, now it becomes a judgment of or a decision making from the every obstetricians to figure out whether it is nice to let the fetus to grow with that endurable hostile maternal immune system, or to bring it out and use it in a neonatal ICUs. This is a very crucial and a critical decision making. And probably, hopefully, if everyone puts our mind together to figure out which is the best way to take a call, at which point of the fetal distress, at which point of the immune system's disturbances, we can take a call to take the baby out. Because now, at least now we are well equipped to manage in the neonatal ICU a baby who is come out after 22 to 28 weeks. So if that's the case, when the maternal uterus becomes a hostile, then the choice is to come out of it and take a chance to grow out of that. So I mean, that looks little non-naturalistic statement, but that's what we need to really see when the immune systems are hostile. I think we can, Dr. Mekla, we can conclude the session.
Yes, sir. Yes. I think all of them have cleared most of the doubts that normally a person would have. And of course, at the end of an IVF spectrum, there can be many more, and we can continue the discussion for much longer, probably in some other platform, at some other time, some other point.
Yeah, over to Dr. Prakriti. Yeah.
Medicine is an enigma. We immunologists and obstetricians need to work hand in hand to provide a successful outcome to a distressed couple. The talks we had in session 1 have highlighted this fact remarkably well. I thank all the speakers for enlightening us in such great detail. I also thank both the chairpersons for conducting the sessions. Thank you, sir and ma'am. I take this opportunity to thank our academic partners, RPG Life Sciences and Intus Pharmaceuticals Limited. We now move on to inaugural function of online 18th Chandray Update 2020. I request the panelists, Dr. Chandrasekhar, Dr. Renuka, and Dr. Sridharan to formally inaugurate 18th Chandray Update 2020.
Yeah.
I request Dr. Chandrasekhar to welcome the gathering.
At the outset, it was an immense pleasure and a privilege to welcome all of you to the 18th Chandray Update. And it's our continued endeavor to have the medical education as a part and parcel of our every 1 year we grow. I think now we have grown from 18th to 19th. Probably we have crossed moving towards the teenage. So hopefully we should be much more active as a team with 18 years of experience of childhood now. In this meeting, as I said, we are focusing on one more issues which we are going to focus tomorrow. And for this, I welcome all our distinguished faculties of today as well as of tomorrow's. And I welcome Professor Sridharan, who is our ethical committee chairman and who is also the administrator of our IARET trust. And I welcome all my staff, all our other delegates to be the part of this Chandray update. Welcome you all.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. I welcome you on behalf of everyone. Next, I request Dr. Renuka P., Director and Chief Pathologist, Chandray Diagnostic Laboratory, to deliver the report of both CDL and CRICR for the year.
Thank you, Dr. Prakriti. It gives me immense pleasure to read out this 18th annual update All of us have gone through a pandemic, and actually we are very thankful that we are safe and are able to conduct this Chandray update in an appropriate way, though it is not a live one. I mean, we could at least do it virtually. Established in 2012, the Chandray rheumatology, the Chandray has grown and diversified fairly well in the past 18 years. See, the Rheumatology Center, in spite of all the COVID, could tide over the crisis without any fatality of a staff. That itself is a great thing, because we had very less problems coming in because of the COVID. And the research activity of the taking opportunity in this kind of situation, the research activity of the organization has actually increased, and it has grown in the last 8 months, and literally 5 to 6 studies have been initiated for the studying the impact of the SARS-CoV-2 in patients with autoimmune disorders. The other good thing which has happened is Dr. Praveen, who is a rheumatologist with a DM qualification, has joined the organization, increased the strength of qualified rheumatologists other than Dr. Chandrasekhar and Dr. Pinish. The fellowship course was started by Dr. Chandrasekhar about 10 years back. And in the last 10 years, about more than 15 fellowship students have passed out. This year, 3 fellowship students have passed out, Dr. Murli from Guntur, Dr. Shivputra from Gulbarga, and Dr. Ramakrishna Giri from Nepal. All of them have gone back to the cities and have started their rheumatology practice, and they're doing pretty well. Along with Chandray Rheumatology Immunology Center, Chandray Diagnostic Laboratory has always supported it through the process of growth of the organization. It's an NABL accredited laboratory, and it has tie-up with multiple hospitals, labs, and with a lot of public sector organizations, with a wide menu of assays, and is known for reliable and precise lab reports, with a team of qualified consultants, pathologists, biochemists, microbiologists, well-trained, dedicated staff to answer any query. This year, I'm glad to say that we have expanded our molecular biology department and have set up the RT-PCR lab for COVID-2, the SARS-CoV-2 infection. And we got approval for NABL and procedures for conducting the RT-PCR assays. Both antigen, antibody, as well as the RT-PCR assays are being done over here. In addition to that, the Chandray Journals, which is a free online access journal, has continued its successful journey, establishing good outreach of the journal throughout. It's a major open access journal in the field of autoimmune diseases in India. Indexing of the journals in international database has promoted growth in the field of rheumatology and clinical immunology. The Chandray Journals would achieve a major milestone with the launch of the Indian Journal of Inflammation in 2017. And this year they were quite excited, basically because probably there would be a forthcoming yearbook on inflammation, which is scheduled to be published by the Society of Inflammation Research. And the key goal of the book is to provide the most up-to-date information on cutting-edge research concerning chronic inflammation, its direct and indirect determinants and fundamentals, and the latest management protocols and clinical. The various journals are there, particularly the Indian Journal of Rheumatology, which is the most popular among the internet journal or the Chandray journals. The Research Assist is a concept which is a scientific research and communication company that aims to provide professional assistance for various scientific, medical, and clinical research. This is another wing of Chandray Group, and it has achieved several project milestones. Through the Research Assist, our team has gone to various medical colleges. Though this year they could not do that, but online they have helped. And we're glad to say that we have completed more than 100 research-related products within for various professors, for various medical colleges, including for professors and students. And it has published a book for general public related to arthritis, and special book on treat to target in rheumatoid arthritis, along with videos demonstrating how pain assessment can be done on patient. The team is currently working in the volume of inflammation book along with the help of the Chandray Journal team, which is intended to provide the most up-to-date information on cutting-edge research in the field of chronic inflammation. So along with the clinical activities and the laboratory growth, the journals and the research team, the Chandray has also tried to see that clinical trials are also going on, and we have also been helping out patients for getting free treatment for some of them. So it has been trying to do its social responsibility, and the paramedical course which has been run under the aegis of NS Paramedical College. We have been continuing. Online classes have been continuing over there, and most of our faculty have been taking part in all the activities. So in spite of the COVID, in spite of the problems, it has not happened a single day that we have actually either closed down or had anything, and I think we should be thankful about that. And for all this, I really appreciate the help and support of all our team, all the entire Chandray team, including consultants, staff, as well as all our support patrons and the labs, the hospitals, the clinicians who supported us throughout in the process so that we can grow from strength to strength. With this opportunity, I would like to thank everybody who have supported us in the growth of the organization. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. And even with such a great example, probably Chandray would never stop, not even for a pandemic. We have all seen that. Next, we now move on to the report on IARET, Immunology and Arthritis Research and Education Trust, by Dr. Sridharan D, Administrator, IARET.
Thank you. As the administrator, it's my duty to give an annual report of the activities of the trust. So the Immunology, Arthritis and Research Education Trust was started in 2000, year 2000, with the objective of educating both the masses and the medical fraternity regarding rheumatology and immunology, and also to be of help to the underprivileged in the society by way of service. So this is the original motto of the trust, and what all activities we have been able to do on this motto. I would like to list a few, highlighting what we have done this year. The trust is involved in following activities: organizing this scientific update program, that is the Chandray update program, for the past 18 years as a mark of birthday celebration of the Chandray group. This scientific activity has become a recognized event over the years, and then we involve national faculties to take part in this, and postgraduate students and the faculty from medical colleges and practicing clinicians and primary physicians also are interested, and routinely they attend this update program. And so we are happy about this, and we would like to continue this and enlarge the concept further. The trust is extending financial assistance to the fellowship students in CRICR, that is Chandray Rheumatology Immunology Center and Research, for completion of their project work. So for the completion of their project work, they may have to do certain special tests required, even though they may do a data analysis study on the retrospective aspect. They may have to do a few of the tests for the patients. So these tests, we subsidize that, and then we take up the cost so that the fellowship students do not suffer on the financial aspect on that. The trust has created a corpus fund of about 14 lakhs as of now, and the interest accrued on the same is used for the different programs of the trust. So over the years, we have been, as we started off with a small organization, now we have grown to an extent so that we have a corpus fund, and then the interest on that, we would like to use it for all the activities. Until now, the major support for the trust was from the Chandray family, that is from Chandray Rheumatology Immunology Center and Chandray Diagnostic Laboratory, directly and indirectly. Now it has taken a foothold, and so the trust itself can manage to do certain activities with the help of these two organizations. In the area of the community service, the trust over the years has extended support to the needy and non-affordable patients in different ways as follows. This is a major thrust area of the trust. So what all we have done and what we hope to, how we go to enlarge all these activities, I would like to list a few of that. A total number of 140 patients are being supported over the past years, including new additions of about 30 patients this year, which includes free consultation and support towards their lab and other investigations, and also repeated follow-ups. So these people, as you know, rheumatoid arthritis and other autoimmune diseases are quite chronic diseases. They need a repeated consultation, and to maintain their lifestyle in a proper way, they need to visit the consultant repeatedly. So these patients who are identified by the trust as needy and non-affordable, their follow-up is also managed by the trust to an extent possible. So like this, we have some 1,040 patients visits every year. Over the years, we have been following up all these follow-ups are done either free or subsidized. This includes free consultation for the initial and subsequent follow-up visits, subsidized or free investigation for all the consultation visits, free drug dispensing from the drug bank. In this respect, this year we have expanded this activity with the dispensation of free drugs to about 50 needy patients. This includes tablets, IV infusions, and even for a few patients, specialized daycare medications as required, with the admission facility partly looked after by the trust and other donors. Trust has been able to link up with other NGOs, non-governmental organizations, for further support to the needy and non-affordable. In this expansion activity of this year, 6 patients have been given monetary support by the NGOs on our initiative. We have identified the NGOs, we have given them the information regarding the patients, their need, and directly to the patients, monetary support was extended from the NGOs, not through us directly, but the initiative started from the trust. That is what we are trying to do, so that the needy patients are identified by the donors and they get the satisfaction of, say, donating directly to a patient, so that there is no intermediary involved here. This year, the trust has been able to involve in the distribution of needy orthotic equipments. You know, chronic arthritis patients may need support in so many ways of, say, the footwears or the, say, support systems like crutches and other things. So whatever is available with the trust or those given by the donors, we are extending this to the needy patients. And that is a new aspect which has been added this year for our activities. Regarding our annual program of recognizing good scientific work related to immunology and rheumatology by the young scientists, that is, the trust is presenting awards to best dissertations from medical postgraduates across the different medical colleges in India. This is a program we have been continuing for a long time now. In the past few years, the trust has given away 6 awards of excellence and 6 other awards of merit with cash prize. So this program has a setback because of the COVID situation this year. So due to prevailing COVID-19 pandemic situation, this year we did not get any submissions for these awards in spite of our effort in putting up requests online. So we could not reach the medical college by post or posters and all that. But online announcement was done, and we hoped that we will get some submissions, but we couldn't get any submission. So this program was curtailed because of the COVID pandemic to an extent. So with these observations or our activities report, I would like to These expansion activities in the trust this year was possible with the addition of a new personnel dedicated for the identification of needy patients and to coordinate with donors and organizations. So we have added a new personnel apart from me and others already existing, so that he is acting as a counselor with the patients and tries to talk to them and then find out their need and find out their financial status, and then tries to identify those who are really non-affordable and need some support. So like this, he was able to initiate this process this year and identify more than 25 patients, and we have extended what little support the trust can give it to them. So this, in spite of the pandemic, they were able to do some work from their trust and then extend our support. As usual, we have been supporting the organization regarding the publication of different publications from the organization also. So that has also been going on. So this is the report. I hope people get initiated and try to help the trust in expanding its activities by donations and physical or emotional or psychological support to the trust activities. Thank you.
Learning gives creativity. Creativity leads to thinking. Thinking provides knowledge, and knowledge makes you
Not
great.
clear. It's voice is not
Am I
heard.
audible?
Now it's okay.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
As told by Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam, learning gives creativity. Creativity leads to thinking. Thinking provides knowledge, and knowledge makes you great. Knowledge is power. This is what our mentors at Chandra Institute truly believe and have continued the tradition to train several fellows like us, adding to the growing rheumatologists across the country and with the previous passed out fellow across the globe. I request Dr. Chandrasekhar to provide fellowship course details and award the fellowship certificates.
Thank you. I think as all of you know that our fellowship program is going on from quite some time. We upgraded our fellowship program, which used to be 1 year to 2 years. I think the last of the first year fellowship was Dr. Murli, and subsequently the fellowship were all moved to 2 years. And I think we have this time 3 of our fellow students being awarded this time. Dr. Murali Krishna, who has his fellowship done from 2017 to December 2017. He is from Kadapa, and he has established himself in Kadapa as one of the good leading rheumatologists. I congratulate Dr. Murali Krishna, and we will hand over the fellowship certificate to you. Of course, now virtually the real one will reach you by post.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. The next candidate is Dr. Shivaputra Ganti. Of course, I think he wanted to be a part of the program, but I think unfortunately he is in the flight, so he is unable to probably to join the program. I think I congratulate him, and also will see to that this the certificate reaches him in time. And the next doctor is Dr. Ramakrishna Giri. Ramakrishna Giri is from Nepal. He came all the way across for his training for 2 years of training. He completed his training from 2018 to 2019. And I think he is with us online, Ramakrishna Giri.
Yes, sir, I'm online.
Yeah, you have to on your video.
Yeah, I'm trying to, but it's stopped by the host.
Oh, okay. Karthik, switch on. Switch on is Dr. Giri's video. I congratulate Dr. Ramakrishna Giri. I think he was a part of us, especially during the pandemic. And I think he took all the endurance and all the troubles of the pandemic during his tenure. And he could also move back to his hometown in the peak of the pandemic. I think I congratulate him and wish him all the best for his future endeavor as a rheumatologist in Nepal. Nepal needs a lot more rheumatologists, and hopefully he will fulfill the necessity of that place. Congratulations and all the best, Ramakrishna.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Chandra.
So with this,
Congratulations to both of you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
So I think with this, we are continuing our program of fellowship, and which will be continued on till such time we upgrade ourselves to the DNB or any other programs. Thank you very much for your support.
Thank you, sir. And I congratulate all the fellowship awardees. I now request Dr. Renuka to release the souvenir for 18 Chandra Update 2020.
No, you have to say released, I think.
Released.
Yeah.
Karthik.
Dr. Chishika, I think you can do it.
Yeah, no, I think Karthik, could you get that on?
Just a second, sir. I'm getting it on.
Yeah, sure.
This souvenir we have been publishing from the beginning every year with our program of Chandra Update. So this souvenir is going to be printed. Now we are showing you a few pages of the souvenir virtually. So the printed souvenir will reach all the delegates later. Maybe it takes some time for us to process and send it across.
Trying to get it.
Click the arrow on the side.
Yeah.
I think it's loading.
Yeah, it's loading.
Can we?
Yeah.
You'll have to repeat it once again. Okay, now we can do it.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think.
Thank you, ma'am. Next, I request Dr. Chandrasekhar to release the book on exercise guidelines, which is now available in Malayalam. With that, we have released exercise guidelines in all the Dravidian languages along with English.
Yeah.
I'm getting it on.
Yeah, I think I declare this released.
This is a part of our initiative from the physiotherapy department. So to hand over the actuality of how to do an exercise, they will explain everything and also hand over this booklet, which will show all the exercises. So here we are not unable to show that exercise pages, but this booklet is available in the English, Kannada, Telugu, Hindi, and now Malayalam. So we are trying to make it a pan-India booklet for use by anyone who needs a translation. So thank you, sir, for releasing.
Thank you, sir. This is a great initiative to help the patients personally. Next, I request Dr. Renuka to propose the vote of thanks.
First and foremost, I would like to thank all the faculty who have agreed to come and share their knowledge with us and become a faculty for our update. I would like to thank Dr. Sridharan sir for making it happen, and the entire team, like the software team, the IT team, all of them who have tried to see to it that this update happens. all the academic partners and the entire staff of Chandray for being a part of Chandray for so long and supporting and growing it us and trying to make the CME successful each year. And most of all, I would like to thank all the delegates who have making the CME successful, because I know there are a lot of online sessions going on, but still I think there are quite a few who have joined us in this CME, and I really appreciate that, and thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. I thank you on behalf of everyone.
Thank you.